Hello, friends. So today I'm going to talk about religion and how to write religion into a fantasy setting, how that will influence different people, different cultures, different societies, nations. Now, I originally did a long video talking about all the different main kinds of religion, and it just ended up being too long, and so I decided to break it up into separate videos. Today I'm going to talk about monism. Monism being the belief that all things are kind of incorporated into one great whole. And a real world example of monism would be Taoism. And in Taoism, there's this sense that everything is one, and that distinctions that we see, definitions that we see, are all lies. It's the real truth is that everything is one. Everything is together as one thing. Okay. Now, the main thing that all religions have in common, religions believe all kinds of different things. The main thing that they all have in common is this belief that there is something wrong with the world, or that there seems to be something wrong with the world, right? So, from the perspective of monism, from a monist faith, what is wrong is that people believe in these distinctions. People are led astray by this falsehood that there are individual identities. And so, what is to be done? Well, in very general terms, monists believe that the main thing that needs to be done is that people need to see that all of these divisions that they perceive are not real. All the problems that we experience in the world exist because we believe this lie that things are divided and separate. And so, but because of the very vague and high level approach that monists take to religion, they tend to not have a clear set of moral laws. Like in Christianity and Judaism, you have the Ten Commandments, right? But in monism, you wouldn't. A monist faith would not have something as clearly defined as that, because that defies the whole perception of monism, right? It puts things into little neat boxes when monism says that those boxes should not even exist. Now, next question that I have that I want to ask of different religions is there a sense of universal struggle? From the perspective of a monist faith, not really, because any struggle that you would perceive is itself a lie from a monist perception. So the great universal struggle then is just the struggle within the individual to overcome this lie that all these other struggles exist, right? And so the monist feels that instead of struggling against a different nation or a different idea, you need to just accept everything and realize that it all comes together in one whole. Monism is syncretic, meaning it is very accepting of other faiths, even faiths of different types. Monists will naturally be very accepting of animists, of pantheists, of polytheists, monotheists, because they see all of this as part of that one great whole. But they will see these parts as suboptimal perceptions of the one great truth, right? They see them as accurate to some extent, but incomplete. Now, see, how does monism view force? Monism views force as something that is not really good. As a general thing, you'll see this in Taoism. You'll see that Taoists, they have this idea of how a Taoist should be like water. And so water exerts force, but it does so in a very gentle, gradual way. Water when you put water against rock, in the beginning it will seem that the rock is stronger, but over time you will discover that the water is stronger. So they do believe in force in a way, but not in the most direct way, not in like so much in violent force. But because monism tends to not have clearly defined rules and regulations and laws, it's relatively easy for people who purport to be monists to resort to force whenever it becomes something that they want to do, because even though it's at a high level, it contradicts what they supposedly believe in, there aren't these very specific, very hard laws saying you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, right? Um, Now, see, does it influence government? Monism can, of course, influence government, as any religion can, but it's going to have much less of a tendency to do so because because a monist faith is, and you see this in Taoism, it's necessarily going to be much less organized and institutionalized because that concept of creating a religious institution, a religious authority, defies the basic principles of monism. It creates this sense of distinction, right? And so it's of separation. And so a monist faith will have much less of a tendency to, for example, try to become an organ in the government, or try to have a figure like the Pope, who, like he did in the Middle Ages, exert direct influence over the laws of various countries and things like that. Monist faith will have much less of a tendency to do that. Does it proselytize? Taoists did proselytize for a long time. They did. But the thing is that when you intrinsically, when you begin with this idea that everything is all part of one whole, when you are syncretic, when you are very accepting of other faiths, there's not as much of a motivation to go and proselyte. And also there's not as much motivation for people to accept your message. Because what is your message? It's hard. It's much harder to communicate a clear message that people can understand if you begin by saying, oh, but the name that you know is not the real name. The things that you perceive are not really real. So in the end, people end up with more questions than answers from the very beginning, right? There's no clear set of things for you to go and do. Like, I was a missionary for 2 years, not for a monist faith, for a monotheistic faith, which we'll talk about later. And I did not, I can go on and on and on about the deep ideas of my religion, but I could always start from very basic principles and tell people a few things that are true and tell them a few things that they should do. And this is a type of faith that is easy to proselytize in a way, because you have a very clear message that you can give to people. Yeah, you can build on that basic message later on, but in the beginning, there's a few very basic things for you to go and do, right? And that's a lot harder with monism, and because it kind of defies the principles of monism. A monist will not have just a few things that you should go and do as part of a faith. Oh, you need to go repent, you need to pray, you need to get baptized. A monist isn't going to say that. It doesn't have, because that implies that names do have meaning, that there is a path to follow, despite how the Tao Te Ching in the beginning says that the path that you know is not the real path. So to answer that question, monists aren't going to have as much of a tendency to proselytize because they don't see as much of a need for it, and other people aren't going to see as much of a need to accept it. In part because monists are so syncretic, right? So a monist faith could dominate a country, but usually only in the absence of another type of faith that is not monist, right? Like if you have an animist faith, that can easily exist simultaneously with monist faith, and we saw this through much of China's history. But when you have a dualist or a monotheist faith, or even a polytheist faith, that tends to kind of overpower monism, because it's much more it's something that people have much more of ability to grasp and to implement in their real lives. Now, does it inspire national or global unity? Well, in a way, monism is very unifying, because fundamentally they say, oh yeah, well, everything is one, right? So fundamentally, yeah, it has this very unifying message, but that's in principle. In practice, it actually doesn't have that much of a unifying force compared to other faiths, because there's no message for people to get behind in the same way, because there isn't this sense of a great universal struggle that all of humanity is pushing against. It's only a struggle within the individual, really. And that struggle is for the individual to realize that the individual is not really an individual. And also, there's no sense of, like, it doesn't make sense to attach monism to nationalism. So you will have much less of a tendency to see kings and emperors try to present their monist faith as this thing that will motivate their people to go to war, or to unify under a common cause and work together to achieve something specific. You could do that. You could do that, but it has much less of a power to do that because of the nature of the faith. It kind of resists that type of a mentality of that type of national narrative. Nationalism just doesn't work very well with monism. Does it encourage asceticism? By asceticism, I mean like creating, institutions with monks and nuns and stuff. Well, it does. Monism does encourage asceticism for the individual, but again, there's much less of a tendency toward creating religious institutions. And so because of that, you will see much less of a tendency toward priestly orders and people going and living in a monastery and things like that. Does it encourage scholarship? It does encourage scholarship. Monism encourages scholarship because it is intrinsically difficult to understand. And when I was a missionary, I had talked to people about Taoism. I wanted them to tell me about Taoism, what they believed, and everyone always told me the first thing they say, "Oh, it's very hard to understand." That's the first thing they would always say. It's like, "Oh, it's very hard to understand." But in that way, monism encourages scholarship because you have to become a scholar in order to even understand the message, because it defies our understanding of our daily lives. It tells us that what we experience in our daily lives is a lie. And it's hard for people to fathom that. It's hard for people to break away from that. So in that way, in order to really be true to the faith, you have to become a scholar. You have to become kind of a philosopher. Everyone does. Otherwise, it's really difficult for the faith to have any meaning. So in that way, monism encourages scholarship and philosophy and introspection. Does monism encourage individuality? It does, but not in the same way as other religions. Monism encourages individuality in the sense that the struggle is individual, is inside. You're struggling against yourself, because what needs to happen more than anything is you need to realize that you are not you, that you are just a part of this one great unit. So the individuality exists in the sense that you're thinking about yourself. You are having this narrative, this discussion with yourself. You're struggling against yourself, all with the purpose of destroying the self and coming to the realization that, oh, the self doesn't even really exist. So it's kind of this weird paradox where it is, in practice, it's very individual. It really emphasizes individuality, but all for the sake of denying the existence of the individual, right? Now, does it encourage colonization? I would say that no, monism does not encourage colonization at all, because it's very accepting of other faiths. And again, the struggle is internal. So it's really hard to build this narrative of, oh, we need to go out and conquer this other nation and bring them under our will so that we can pull their resources into this great global struggle, or this national struggle. Because there isn't a great global or national struggle. There is just the struggle within the individual. So actually a monist faith would be highly antithetical to colonization and to empire building. Of course, Taoism, again, is Chinese, and China was built as an empire. People have I've seen Chinese people try to claim that China never conquered anyone else. It's total baloney. You look at the original China, it's much smaller than what it is now. It got to where it is now through conquest and empire building. But that happened really kind of contrary to Taoism, and not really because of Taoism at all, right? So anyway, tell me what you think. Tell me if there are any other questions you want me to answer about the different types of religions that I'm going to be talking about. My next video is going to be talking about pantheism and how it's a little different from monism, even though they're very similar. And yeah, subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you in the next video.